let me introduce you to Melissa Mueller. She works at Mitsubishi Electric Trane HVAC USA, which may be the longest corporate name I've heard in a while. And she likes to stay cool there. Her Twitter handle is AstroLovesCody. And you know me, of course, I'm Code Fryer. I'm developer evangelist here at Salesforce.com. I like to think in code, but I often have null pointer errors. Something about getting older and children, etc. So with that said, we've got some homework we have to do. We have to do some the forward-looking statement sing along. We're going to talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to actually code our solution to our problem for the day, and then we'll have a recap at the end. And again, if you have questions, comments, or snide remarks, raise your hand and go to webinar and go ahead and ask them. They'll be collated, and we'll deal with them as we get them. So with that said, everybody, let's sing the forward-looking statement song. And if you don't know the forward-looking statement song, that's okay. I don't know it either, but I'm supposed to tell you that this is to remind us of two things. One, it's to remind me not to make any forward-looking statements, and two, it's to remind you that Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and as a result, you should make your purchasing decisions based on the features and services that are generally available and not anything that I might say accidentally as a forward-looking statement. All right, with that, let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to do positive and negative unit testing. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing unit testing, but we're going to look at two patterns today, positive testing and negative testing. And we're going to learn all about those, and we're going to actually implement some positive and negative tests for a class that we have written. So what are positive and negative testing? Well, I'm glad you asked. Melissa, you want to tell us all about positive tests?
Sure, Kevin. Hello, everyone. The great thing about positive tests is that you're expecting a good outcome. We start there and we feed good data to it, which means that you want to, as your first step, make sure that you're using brand new data in the test class, that you're not using any data from your org. So you might want to use a data factory or a CSV file so that you can make assertions to validate your data. Then you want to, after you've created your data, you're going to want to call test.startTest. This is because you want all new governor limits. You don't know how many governor limits you've generated in your loading of test data, so you want to clear all those out. Then you'll execute your code and call test.stopTest. That makes sure that all of your async code is complete. And then you make your assertions. There's three different assertion types. System assert with just your Boolean expression and a failure message, as well as assert equals with the expected, actual, and your failure message, and an assert not equals with your expected and actual and a friendly failure message. Now, make sure you remember to put your friendly failure message in there, because if you don't, you will get messages back from your lint and other types of things that check your code. With that said, Kevin, do you want to tell us about negative tests?
First, I want to comment on friendly failure message. I feel like that's, step one in the Apex Tongue Twisters book. Can you say friendly failure message 10 times fast?
Friendly failure message, friendly failure message, friendly failure message. I don't think so.
So when we write negative unit tests, we're looking to make sure that our code fails as it's supposed to when we expect it to fail, which is a mouthful, and you may be thinking, why would I expect my code to fail? Well, what I mean by this is when you're writing tests or when you're writing your code, there'll be certain points in your code where you as a developer are like, you know what, this may fail, I'm gonna have to throw an exception, or I anticipate that maybe my data coming into this method isn't quite sanitized. We all know not to trust user input, so something about what the user gives us in order to run this particular unit of code may not be quite right. And so we defensively program against that by putting in exceptions so that if we get bad data, we can say, oh no, I got bad data. And instead of letting the program crash, we throw out these exceptions. When we write negative tests, we're actually testing that when we give it bad data, that we do get the exception we're expecting back and that our program continues on instead of dying. So the way we do this is similar to writing a positive unit test, except that we're going to put in a try-catch block here. And you'll see this when we get into the actual code, but the way the pattern works is very similar. We're going to create or generate our test data. We're going to call start test. We're going to create a Boolean variable and set it to false. And this Boolean variable becomes very important here just in a little bit. We're going to start a try-catch block, and we're going to execute the code that we expect to fail with parameters that would cause that failure. And then we're going to catch the failed code's exception, and we're going to make sure that the exception we received was the right kind of exception and that it has the right message we're looking for. So if we throw a bad user data exception, we want to see that the exception caught in our test is a bad user data exception. And when we pass the message of I got unexpected data, that we not only have the right kind of exception, bad user data exception, but that we also have the message we expect, I got bad data. And if that is true, and we have both the exception and the message that we're looking for, then and only then will we assert that our Boolean variable is true. And we check that with an if statement. We're just gonna say if we got the right kind of exception, if we got the right message, then we'll set that Boolean to true. And that's sort of the negative test pattern. Now, the negative testing pattern is sometimes more critical to the success of your software than the positive testing pattern, because you need to make sure that when your code is running, that if it dies, that it dies in a sensible and sane way. And if it throws an exception, that the exception is what you're expecting. So these become really critically important in making sure that your code works even in adverse or unexpected conditions. So,
Kevin?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a quick question back on that last slide. The test.stop test, would you call it after 5, 6, or 7?
Oh, that's a good question. I would call it as part of the catch statement, because I want to make sure that the stop test doesn't mess up what kinds of exceptions I catch.
So you call it after step 6?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Exceptions. That's a great question. I should have, if you notice on here, this little card that we created, it doesn't say call stop test. So we need like step 6.5 in there. We'll have to take care of that. So what are we going to do today? We're gonna write some tests. Melissa's given us a class, and she's going to talk about it here in just a little bit when we switch over to the code. But we're going to be writing some unit tests for that class, and our goals are to have a high test coverage for it. We want to cover as much of the class as we can. We're going to be looking for confidence that our code works as expected. Those are our positive tests. We're going to be writing positive tests, and then we're also going to write some tests that will fail, or cause the code to fail, and we want confidence that when our code fails, it's going to do so when and how we expect. So with that said, I'm going to turn your attention over to this GitHub URL. Again, this will be in the trail mix at the end and in the video as well. But this is where the code that we're writing tests for and our tests will live. So if you want to tune into that, you can see the actual results of what we've done. And let me get out of the slide deck here, and we'll get over to the interesting stuff. We'll go into our code. Okay. So Melissa, do you want to tell us all about this this particular class that we're going to be testing?
Sure. So Kevin, first we have to initialize and create the constructor for the handler. Then when we get into the meat of the code, when the before insert's called, when a contact is created, our trigger handler checks to make sure that the owner of the account that the contact is associated to is an active user. We do this
because... Hold on a second. Let me pause you there. So we're using this is a trigger that we're writing tests for is trigger handler logic, and we're using that trigger framework that Simon and I talked about in our last episode. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Please continue.
No, it's okay. I should have known to said that. Okay, so we check to make sure that the owner of the account that the contact is associated to is an active user. We do this because there are things we may want to do in the future with the contact that may require the account owner is active. One example would be creating a task when an opportunity related to that contact is created. If the account owner is not active, a custom exception is thrown in our code, and we're going to test that. Once the handler has verified that the account owner is active, it sets the contacts level based on the lead source. After we've inserted or updated a contact, the handler checks to see if the contact's level is primary or has been changed to primary. If it has, the handler inserts an opportunity related to the contact with the stage name of needs analysis. If the insert fails, a standard system DML exception will be thrown. Hopefully we'll get coverage on that too. If we update a contact, once again, the handler checks to see if the account owner is still active, and it would throw an exception if they're not there. If the account owner is active, the handler checks to see if there are any cases related to the contact, and if there are, do any of the cases have a priority of high and a status of escalated? If there is such a case, the handler sets the contact's level to primary, which will then create a new opportunity if the contact did not already have a level of primary. So Kevin, are you ready to start doing some testing?
Yeah, let's write some tests. So to do this, where do you think we should start? Should we start with positive or negative tests?
I usually start with the positive tests.
Okay, so let's start with the positive test. Let's kick over to our test class here. Now we've pre-created this test class, but there's obviously nothing here in it. So how would you start off a test, Melissa? A positive test.
I would start with the first thing that I'm doing, creating a contact. I mean, that's what we're doing with the trigger. The whole point is inserting and updating contacts.
Okay. Well, I think this is an interesting place for us to pause here, because one of the things that we talk about with unit testing is that we're writing tests for units of code, not necessarily for methods of code. And sometimes we'll have units that are smaller than the method, and that could be like an if block inside the method or something like that. So when we talk about where to start with our unit tests, we can look at our code here and we can see that, you know, we've got this class and we can start testing some of these things immediately, but it might make sense for us to pick a method and then start writing positive tests for the units in that method. So which method do you think we should start with?
Sorry, I was muted. I would start before insert. Let's see, the way I wrote the code was starting with testing the inserting a tertiary contact, creating an account and inserting a contact with a lead source of web, and then asserting that it's tertiary. That's the way I personally started. That doesn't mean that's the best method.
Okay, so you want to start with the before insert? That's fine. So I like to name my unit tests in a way that gives a clear idea of what they're testing. So how would you name this unit test?
I named mine insert tertiary contact.
Yeah? Okay, well, let's prototype that method.
Okay.
Nope, where's my keyboard shortcut? Okay.
Here, let me try, Kevin.
Okay. My keyboard skills are failing me today. I have a keyboard shortcut set up to say, you know, that is test.
I'm looking at the wrong screen.
Oh,
here we go.
There we go.
Here.
Insert tertiary contact. Now, one of the things that I like to say is, you know, looking at this method name, we don't know what our tertiary contact is supposed to do in this unit test name. It doesn't tell us whether it's a positive or negative test. So I like to append positive if we're going to do that.
That makes sense.
Test. And then, yeah, so one of the things that Visual Studio Code gives you if you're not using Visual Studio Code to write methods is every time you've got an @is_test annotation, we'll get this run test button that we can click underneath it, and that'll actually run just that unit test. So when we get done writing this unit test, we'll be able to run it right from Visual Studio Code by clicking that button. So in our positive unit test, the very first thing we do for a positive unit test pattern is, I'm waiting for the audience out in the world to you know, magically be able to call in and tell us, generate your own data. That's right. Yep. That's right. So what kinds of data do you think we need in order to insert a tertiary contact besides the contact who's got a status of tertiary?
Well, we need an account because the whole point is if they're related to an account, and we also check through the rest of the code if the account owner is active. So we have to have an account.
So one thing I like to do is default to creating data at a global scape for our, not a global scape, but on a per class level for our unit tests until I've got a reason for not doing that. So one of the things that I like to do is at the very top of my method, do an @test setup. And I'm going to call this make data. And then here we can create that account. So we could always just do the account, account equals new account and fill in that information and then insert it. But one of the tips and tricks I like to use in testing is to use a test factory. And I've got a test factory installed here. So I'm going to create this account as an account type. I'm going to cast it. And I'm going to use test factory. I'm going to call it create S object. I'm going to pass in new account. Now here I can create some information about it. I can do, like name equals Cody. Right? We'll test with our superheroes. And one of the options that the test factory I use has is the option to automatically insert it. So I'm going to say true, like that. And so this is going to give us an account and insert it every time this make data method is run. Now, when is the make data method run, Melissa? Are you familiar with the test setup?
Yeah, and when you use test setup, it runs each time before every test that you execute. So you'll get a new set of data every time you execute a test.
Even if that data is the same, it's still fresh data.
Correct, yes.
Right.
And
so,
I think this would be a good time to make the point of, even though your test factory takes a lot more typing, you can actually, if you need hundreds of accounts, initiate hundreds of accounts in just a few clicks, as opposed to writing account after account after account.
Yeah, that's a trade-off. May take more typing for a single account, but if you want to do 500 accounts, it's pretty simple to do that as well. And we can go into that if we need a list. But so we got make data here. That's going to create our account for us. Do we need to query for the account in our insert tertiary contact positive test?
Yes, anytime you use test setup, the data isn't available in your test until you query for it.
Okay, so how do we query for that data?
Well, we know we've only got one account and we're only looking for one account. So I type account and ACCT equals open bracket select account ID name from account where name equals Cody, limit 1.
Tell me what the limit 1.
That makes sure that only one item is returned for your query. That way you're not, you're only declaring one account in your select statement, and you're not declaring a list. So you want to make sure that you only get one item back from, one record back from your query.
Okay. And then, so after we've got our data there, we're also going to need to finish filling out or getting our data, right? So we either need to query for data created in the test setup method, or we need to create our new methods, so our new data. So we need to create an account, right? A contact, right?
Yep.
All right.
And we're not doing that in test setup. I'm sorry, what?
Why are we not doing that in test setup?
We're not doing that in test setup because the whole point of this is an on insert. So we want to test the insert in our test class, not have the contact already created in test setup.
So why don't you show us what that looks like?
Okay. So I would normally do something like this. Oop. And the reason I named the contact not primary is because the primary is a special case, and I can use the same contact name in our next class.
Okay. So we've got a little bit of a name mismatch here. It looks like
Okay.
between the account and account
Oh.
one. So let's.
Yes, we do.
Let
Okay.
me make mine the account one.
Okay.
Dave, we have a note here from Dave. He said, limit one isn't a good decision. If there are two accounts with the name Cody, then you may select the wrong account.
That's true. That's true. But here's the way that breaks down why I'm fairly confident in that. Because we're creating this account in our test setup, we know that we're creating at least one here. And because we're not marking this test as see all data equals true, what we're doing is we're saying we're looking for the Cody that we created, and we don't want a list of them. We just want that first one. So limit one can be dangerous, especially in production code. But when we're dealing with a test and that test is limited to data that this test class created, I think it's a safe idea. That's a good call out though.
I'd agree with Kevin on that.
So we've got our data created here. So our pattern says we're going to create our data, and then we're going to do what? So pattern is create data. Then what do we call?
Test.start test. The magic
Start
limit
test.
resetter.
the DML, the governor resetter. Okay, and then we have to execute our code next. And in this case, since it's a trigger, we're just going to execute that by doing the DML we want to call the logic on. So in this case, we're just going to insert it. So this first part of this insert is going to happen is part of our start, or after our start test. And then what do we do after we've called that method?
Test.stop test.
Test.stop test. And for the record, I tried to get a cheerleading squad to be like test.stop test or test.start test. That didn't really fly. There we go. And so after we've done our stop test, what are we supposed to do in terms of making sure that our code has worked?
We assert.
Okay, and we're asserting what here?
We are asserting that the tertiary, but as you see in my system assert equals, I did not put in the friendly message, which is not good. Expect tertiary. There we go. We're fixed.
Why are we expecting tertiary here?
Because the lead source is web.
We should say that in our
okay.
In our friendly message here. And then you also notice here that we've got an error that variable does not exist at inserted contact down here. So we got to figure out where our inserted contact is coming from, what that is. What do we have to do to find our inserted contact here?
Query. Hey, I've got that query written out and skipped right over it.
Yeah, you want to put that in there?
Yeah, sure.
The magic of TV, television, cooking shows. There we go. So here we've got a contact, and we're doing this as a list.
Okay, Kevin, it looks like we can't see all of the text in your editor, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah.
Let's see. Does that help there?
Let's see.
I can
do
see
something
it.
Else.
Yeah, I think I see everything on there.
I see it in the webinar.
Type more.
Type more. Okay.
All right. Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, we're good.
This is a syntax error.
We are okay.
Okay. So we've got our system assert equals. We've got a friendly error message there. What do we need to do to finish this test out? And looks like our test passed. And unfortunately, it's not showing that there. So it's not showing. We're having some technical difficulties with sharing that bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the test here in our org, and we'll just open up that test class and we'll run our test. And we can do this. We can switch back over here, and we've got code coverage now. So we can see what parts of our code are automatically being tested with just that one positive unit test. This is the code in blue is code that has been tested. You'll notice we've got a lot that hasn't been tested. So let's get back to writing our tests, and let's work on a negative test case now. I'm going to switch back over to our code.
And Kevin, we have a question about if it's possible to avoid using SQL query for accounts declaring account list as a test class attribute.
I'm not quite sure I followed that question. Can you try that again?
Yes. Hi there. A question from Ihor. Thank you for your question, Ihor. Can we avoid using SQL query for accounts declaring account lists as test class attribute?
A test class attribute? You mean like this? Or you're looking like an account test class attribute? Is that what you're referring to?
I think my guess is where on line 15, where we're calling back for the account to find out, to retrieve it after the test setup. That would be my interpretation of his question.
Yeah, are you wondering though if we can use the, like just set this as like a class variable and then use it again? If so, the answer is no. You're still gonna have to query for it, at least right now, because of the way the test setup method works under the covers. It's gonna create that data for you every time, and then what's gonna happen is it's gonna roll back the class at a DML level to where it was at the beginning, rather than recreating that data each time. So you end up with a fresh set of the data, but it only actually has to create it once. And because of that rollback functionality, your class is reset and you won't have that class variable.
And Ihor hasn't responded, but we do have one more question from Prashant.
Okay.
Though I have created one account and 2 contacts associated with that account, I see a duplicate contact is getting created. What am I missing here?
Could have some you could have automation of some kind, so triggers, workflows, flows, or process builder processes that are creating a clone or something on the back end. Without knowing a whole lot more about your org shape, there's a whole I can only venture ideas here, but my guess is that there's some sort of automation that is cloning that record in the background for you. So yeah. I hate to give you a vague answer, Prashant, but that's what I got for right now. We've written a positive test here, Melissa. How about, do you think we should write a negative test now? Should we switch back and forth?
Absolutely. I definitely think a negative test is warranted, especially since the positive tests would just be the exact same thing we've already done with a different lead source. So I named my simplest negative test, insert primary contact, no lead source, because we require a lead source. Otherwise, we throw an exception in the code.
All right, so I appended negative to the end of it. So we've got a nice method there. So we got run that. Now we'll have an account, so we don't need to create that, but we will need to query for it. So I'm going to do the good old copy and paste. There's our account, and we're going to have to create a contact.
We can copy that same contact and just remove the lead source variable.
Yeah, and we might want to rename it because we are trying to do primary. So contact primary, and we'll get rid of the lead source. And contact, so we've got that. Now, with our negative unit test pattern, we need to create a Boolean variable. This is going to be exception was thrown. We'll immediately set it to false. One of my favorite interview questions with Apex is to ask people how many what are the valid, how many number of valid states are there for a Boolean? And everyone says 2, but if you don't set it, then it's null, and that's valid. So,
Yep.
you know, trick question. So exception was thrown false, and then we'll do a try. Oh, hey.
I'm at the ready.
Yeah, you are. Let me format this a little bit. So we're going to format that, and we'll do a catch. And here's where we get very specific in our code. Let's go back to our trigger handler, and we'll just do exception, search for exception. And you'll see that we've got a contact exception here at both those times. And that's the kind of exception we're going to be looking for. So we can actually say we want to catch only a contact exception here. So let's do that. We'll do contact trigger handler.
Here, how about I just paste mine in there for you?
Well, that would, no one would get to
Okay.
laugh at my typos.
All right. If you type like a madman, when you can't see what you're typing, you don't see the backspaces in there.
Yeah, that's true. Contact exception, and we're going to call this, what should we call it? I'm going to call it the best exception. Okay. Now, when we've caught a best exception, the reason this is, I love negative tests because they're so elegant, and we're only going to catch this one type of exception, which means that if we have any other kind of exception, whether it's a DML exception or a runtime exception, our test is still going to fail because we're not catching the right thing. Right. So when we catch our contact trigger exception, our contact exception, what do we need to do to make sure that it's the right exception, the one we expected?
We have to get the message and make sure that it contains that specific message that's being thrown.
Okay. So I like to do equals ignore case. And what should we, the thing I'm just going to do is I'm going to go back over to my contact trigger handler and
copy and paste.
Copy and paste. And the one we're doing right now is you must have a lead source, right?
Correct.
So I'm going to copy this.
And Kevin and Melissa, we do have another question from Kostas. I think this is from about 30 seconds ago or a minute ago. In which cases do we prefer static resources instead of test factory when creating test data?
That's a great question. I like to use test data in static resources, CSVs, whenever I am doing more than one account or whatever the object is. So if I'm doing testing in bulk with, say, 500 accounts, I'm going to create those using a static resource. If I'm going to do it with, if I'm doing like one account at a time, then I just do the test factory. The test factory I use is a great little feature where it'll go and figure out all the things that actually need to have data populated in them based on DML and field rules on the page layout, so that you can just say, give me the account, and then give it the bare minimum of data you want, and it'll figure out the rest of everything for you. So for singular stuff, I use test factory. For multiples of the same one, I use CSVs. I also use CSVs if I'm going to have sort of graphs of data. So if I'm going to have accounts and contacts and opportunities and opportunity line items all for, all linked together, then I'll use a CSV. And so, Melissa, I've got this set up here with a very specific, we're going to grab our exceptions message, and if it equals ignores case, you must enter a lead source. Then what should we do?
Well, I would say if it equals that, then return true. But I wrote mine a little bit differently.
Yeah? That's fine.
So how would you do it, Kevin?
I think I would just say exception was thrown equals true.
Okay.
And that's my try catch block, and then I would do a system.assert equals. I can type system assert equals, and I'll do exception was thrown, and then I'll leave myself a friendly message. I'll say expected to get a contact exception with the message. Enter a lead source.
So,
I'm gonna make this down there. You must enter a lead source like that.
so I'm going to throw this in here, not to leave it there, but just so people see the difference of how I would have put the catch block. These next two lines are what I would have put inside the catch block, or 4 lines. It would have been my catch block. It's the same, almost exactly the same thing, except I'm returning my true false if statement directly to the Boolean and then making an assertion. They work equally the same. They're just 2 different ways of writing the code. And that's not something that is necessary, but I just thought, since I said I'd do it differently, I should explain.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Let's do this. Let's comment yours out.
Yep.
And then I'm going to save this and let's run it and see how things are looking in terms of our test working. So have we written a positive test? Uh-oh, we've got a failure to push. We've got an error on line 39.
Oh, you don't have a parentheses, close parentheses.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, yeah, you do on the next line. Why is it yelling at you?
That's a good question. Comparison arguments must be compatible. Types Boolean and string. Oh. It's because I did assert equals, which takes 3 parameters. What is and what it should equal. And then the friendly message. I just want a system.assert, which this has to be true. Let's save that. Okay, now I'm going to go over back to our other computer here, and let's open up our contact trigger handler tests. Again, we'll refresh this. So we'll open, here's our new test method down here. Let's go ahead and run these tests. Okay, now this one gave us a failure. Insert failed. The joys of computing here. I'm getting to insert failed, first exception on row 0.
One of those fun exceptions.
Yeah.
No clue.
Failed on before insert. You must specify a lead source. So our exception was thrown, it looks like.
It just wasn't caught.
It just wasn't caught. And I wish this would show up here under the, let's do this. Oh, it's not showing up. That's so sad. Okay, so I'm seeing this lovely exception in my window, and I'm trying to make this come up here, but it says we've got an exception that was thrown, the contact exception, but we didn't actually catch our proper exception. So let's look here in our test where we're looking at this exception, and let's actually look at debugging out what our system debug. I like to put some hash marks there so I can find it pretty easily. And then I'll do the fast exception. And then I'll actually put out get message. We'll save that and let's rerun this. Looks like we've got another failure. Okay, that makes sense. Now let's look at it over here again and see if we can't see what happened in our logs. So let's make this a lot bigger. Hey, look, you can read it now. And I'm going to search in here for my hash marks. Huh. Does not look like that made it all the way up there. Let's try saving that again. We'll push that up. And then we'll reload our test class. Contact trigger handler test. Run this. Look at our logs. Come on, computer, you can load the logs. Interesting. Oh, here we go. Where in our logs is our, it's not actually catching that exception.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so we're never seeing that output. So you've got this here, the best exception, it's never catching that. Let's make sure we got the right kind of exception here. So at the top of this, we've got contact exception, which is part of contact trigger handler. Let's try just getting rid of this. Save that. See if we run the test, what happened. Oh, we got some problems.
Try making the catch just exception instead of contact exception.
Well, yeah, we can do that next here, but I'm trying to figure out.
Line 33, you've got an invalid type contact exception.
Yeah. So try that. So you just want to try exception?
Well, contact exception inherits from the exception class, so that works. I know that works.
That'll work, but I don't know that we're gonna. We still want to catch the specific type of exception. So that didn't give us assertion failed. So let's look at that. Let's see what it comes up with. Okay, the best exception says insert failed first row, cannot insert update caused by. And so this is what we're looking for. Okay, so we did catch the exception, but we didn't actually trap the right kind of exception. Let's debug that a little bit. Get message. So let's. Oh, it's going to be. It has all of that information in it. Because look, when I debugged it, it has insert failed, all of this, not just this here. So your way of doing it at the bottom of the test, Melissa, where you had it set up to do contains.
Yes.
That
is
looks
only
like the
catching
way
part
to
of
go.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, let's try this.
They can't see your Visual Studio code that you're writing.
I am okay.
There we go.
I just changed this to contains, and it's saying that we've got an override conflict here because of the project was open in the dev console as well. Looks like we're going to switch over to the dev console for time being because of that. So now we've got this set up. We're going to do contact exception, but we got to do contact trigger handler contact exception. And instead of equals ignore case, we'll say contains. Okay, let's try this. Insert failed, first exception. So this looks like we're not actually capturing, like we're still having problems capturing the right exception. Huh. That's interesting. What do you think might be going on, Melissa?
I honestly don't know. I just know the way that I wrote it, it works. That sounds so horrible. I apologize.
No, I mean, that's fine. You've got contact exception. You're just writing it as an exception. It's a little loosey-goosey for me. I'm trying to figure out what we can do to make that tighten up, but let's make sure that this passes as it is. Okay, so this looks like it succeeded.
Yeah, that does.
So we are catching the exception. It's interesting. Caused by contact.
Exception was thrown true.
Yep.
There must be something about the way you're handling the assertion.
I'm not entirely sure. This is weird. I'm just going to copy and paste this back in here. Oh, you know what? It's an insert, so it's a DML exception, not a contact exception. I bet you that's what it is. Let's try that. Insert failed. So if we do if I spell correctly, exception, and that, there we go. That's what it was. So let's talk about what's going on here. So our contact trigger handler test, we have this DML exception, the best exception, right? And we're trying to trap for this exception that is thrown down here in our insert set level on insert. But while we've got code that is throwing a contact exception, what's actually happening is we're doing DML, and that DML is failing because of this exception. So the exception we can catch is the DML, not the contact exception.
And the reason, yep, and the reason mine worked is because my code just said exception and didn't specify the DML part, which, as you stated, is loosey-goosey, but it got me through.
But you know, a sort of amalgam of our two approaches is what we ended up using, and we'll make sure we get that pushed up to the GitHub stuff. At this point, though, we've only got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to switch us back over to slides, which is the less exciting portion of this. So let's switch over to the slides and talk about what we did today. There we go. So we identified some units and based those units based off of not the method, but a particular section of the code that we were trying to test. So with our negative test, we were trying to test a particular subsection of that method. We wrote some positive unit tests and we wrote some negative unit tests. And we try to make these useful by giving, you know, friendly error messages. So we always use the final optional assert parameter. And then we also tried to make this as clear as possible by working with our test setup method to make the data. And then only inserting that data or only creating the data outside of that when we needed to. So I always like to try to put a key takeaway slide up, and so if you tuned in today, what I want you to walk away from is the idea that unit testing helps you craft better software. We didn't go into this much, but part of what we're doing when we write these unit tests is gaining confidence that our code is working like we expect it to, and as part of the process of that, we discover that we can learn more about the system and our coding as we write these unit tests. So I had written a unit test that used equals ignore case, but we needed a contains. And by working together and writing these unit tests, we actually learned a little bit more about how everything works. A unit is not exactly a method. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's an entire method. It could be. Oftentimes, if you're testing a constructor, that constructor, you test the whole thing. And then the positive unit tests build confidence that your code works as expected with a known set of inputs, and that your negative unit tests build confidence that your code fails how and when it should, as you expect it to. So we've got a few more minutes for questions and answers. Nisha, do we have any other questions that have come in?
No, we don't.
Okay. Well, let's look at this. I want you to go and take this trail mix that I put together for you out on Trailhead. You can get to it by this URL here, sforce.co/positive-negative testing. There are two modules here. One is the standard Apex testing module, and the other one is this unit testing on the Lightning platform. The unit testing on the Lightning platform one, I'm biased. I helped write that one, so I think it's fantastic, but it is a little long. But there is a module, a unit in that module specifically for positive testing and one specifically for negative testing. So I want to commend that to you. And then I'm going to put the link to our source code repository here so you can see all of the code that we actually wrote and got that out there. So that link is also there at the bottom of this slide. But again, I want you to go to Trailhead and take this trail mix. Again, you can always sign up for our next Code Live session as well on the events page. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a ton. And we will